Welcome back, everybody, to the Anarchist audio library. Today we are going to be reading another one of political hero of mine, Thomas Sankara's speeches. The title of this one is "The Revolution Cannot Triumph Without the Emancipation of Women." If you'd like to either read along or download the original book the English translation came from, please feel free to follow the link in the description. The Revolution Cannot Triumph Without the Emancipation of Women by Thomas Sankara, March 8th, 1987. It is not an everyday occurrence for a man to speak to so very many women at once, nor does it happen every day that a man suggests to so many women new battles to be joined. A man experiences his first bashfulness the minute he becomes conscious that he is looking at a woman. So, sisters, you will understand that despite the joy and the pleasure it gives me to be speaking to you, I still remain a man who sees in every one of you a mother, a sister, or a wife. I hope, too, that our sisters here from Kadiogo province who do not understand French, the foreign language in which I will be giving my speech, will be patient with us, as they have always been. After all, it is they who, like our mothers, accepted the task of carrying us for 9 months without a complaint. Sankara then explains in the Moor language that these women would receive a translation. Comrades, the night of August 4th gave birth to an achievement that was most beneficial for the Burkina people. It gave our people a name and our country new horizons. Imbued with the invigorating sap of freedom, the men of Burkina, the humiliated and outlawed of yesterday, received the stamp of what is most precious in the world, honor and dignity. From this moment on, happiness became accessible. Every day we advance toward it, heady with the first fruits of our struggles, themselves proof of the great strides we have already taken. But this selfish happiness is an illusion. There is something crucial missing. Woman, she has been excluded from this joyful procession. Though our men have already reached the edges of this great garden that is the revolution, our women are still confined within the shadows of anonymity. Among themselves, in voices loud or soft, they talk of the hopes that have embraced Burkina, hopes that are, for them, still merely fine words. The revolution's promise is already a reality for men, but for women, it is still merely a rumor. And yet the authenticity and the future of our revolution depends on women. These are vital and essential questions because nothing whole, nothing definitive or lasting could be accomplished in our country as long as a crucial part of ourselves is kept in this condition of subjugation. A condition imposed in the course of centuries by various systems of exploitation. Starting now, the men and women of Burkina Faso should profoundly change their image of themselves, for they are part of a society that is not only establishing new social relations, but is also provoking a cultural transformation, upsetting the relations of authority between men and women, and forcing each to rethink the nature of both. This task is formidable but necessary, for it will determine our ability to bring our revolution to its full stature, unleash its full potential, and show its true meaning for the direct, natural, and necessary relations between men and women, the most natural of all relations between people. This will show to what extent the natural behavior of man has become human, and to what extent he has realized his human nature. This human being, this vast and complex combination of pain and joy, solitary and forsaken yet creator of all humanity, suffering, frustrated and humiliated, and yet endless source of happiness for each one of us, this source of affection beyond compare, inspiring the most unexpected courage, this being called weak but possessing untold ability to inspire us to take the road of honor, this being of flesh and blood and of spiritual conviction, this being, woman, is you. You are our mothers and life companions, our comrades in struggle, and because of this fact, you should, by rights, assert yourself as equal partners in the joyful victory feasts of the revolution. It is in this light that all of us, men and women, must define and affirm the role and place of women in society. Therefore, we must restore to man his true image by making the reign of freedom prevail over differentiations imposed by nature, and by eliminating all kinds of hypocrisy that sustain the shameless exploitation of women. Posing the question of women in Burkinabe society today means posing the abolition of the system of slavery to which they've been subjected for millennia. The first step is to try to understand how this system works, to grasp its real nature and all its subtlety, in order then to work out a line of action that can lead to women's total emancipation. In other words, in order to win this battle that men and women have in common, we must be familiar with all aspects of the woman question on a world scale and here in Burkina. We must understand how the struggle of the Burkinabe women is part of a worldwide struggle of all women, and beyond that, part of the struggle for the full rehabilitation of our continent. Thus, women's emancipation is at the heart of the question of humanity itself, here and everywhere. The question is thus universal in character. The class struggle and the worldwide status of women. We undoubtedly owe it to dialectical materialism for having shed the greatest light on the problem of the conditions women face, allowing us to lay out the problem of the exploitation of women in the framework of a general system of exploitation. Dialectical materialism defines human society not as a natural, unchangeable fact, but as something working on nature. Humankind does not submit passively to the power of nature, it takes control over this power. This process is not an internal or a subjective one. It takes place objectively in practice, once women cease to be viewed as mere sexual beings and we look beyond their biological functions and become conscious of their weight as an active social force. What is more, women's consciousness of herself is not only a product of her sexuality. It reflects her position as determined by the economic structure of society, which in turn expresses the level reached by humankind in technological development and relations between classes. The importance of dialectical materialism lies in having gone beyond essential biological limits and simplistic theories about our being slaves to nature, and having laid out the facts in their social and economic context. From the first beginnings of human history, man's mastering of nature has never been accomplished with his bare hands alone. The hand with the opposable thumb reaches out for the tool, which increases the hand's power. It was thus not physical attributes alone, musculature or the capacity to give birth, for example, that determined the unequal status of men and women, nor was it technological progress as such that institutionalized this inequality. In certain cases, in certain parts of the globe, women were able to eliminate the physical difference that separated them from men. It was rather the transition from one form of society to another that served to institutionalize women's inequality. This inequality was produced by our own minds and intelligence in order to develop a concrete form of domination and exploitation. The social function and role to which women have been relegated ever since is a living reflection of this fact. Today, her childbearing functions and the social obligation to conform to models of elegance determined by men prevent any woman who might want to from developing a so-called male musculature. For millennia, from the Paleolithic to the Bronze Age, relations between the sexes were, in the opinion of the most skilled paleontologists, positive and complementary in character. So it was for 8 millennia. As Friedrich Engels explained to us, relations were based on collaboration and interaction, in contrast to the patriarchy, where women's exclusion was a generalized characteristic of the epoch. Engels not only traced the evolution of technology, but also of the historic enslavement of women, which occurred with the appearance of private property, when one mode of production gave way to another, and when one form of social organization replaced another. With the intensive labor required to clear the forests, cultivate the fields, and put the natural resources to best use, a division of labor developed. Self-interest, laziness, indolence, in short, taking the most for oneself with the least effort, emerged from the depths of the human spirit and became elevated into principles. The protective tenderness of the woman toward the family and the clan became a trap that delivered her up to domination by the male. Innocence and generosity fell victim to deceit and base motives. Love was made a mockery of and human dignity scorned. All genuine human feelings were transformed into objects of barter. And from this moment on, women's hospitality and desire to share were overpowered by cunning and treachery. Though conscious of this treachery, which imposed on her an unequal share of the burdens, the woman followed the man in order to care for all that she loved. For his part, the man exploited her great self-sacrifice to the hilt. Later, this seed of criminal exploitation was set in terrible social imperatives, going far beyond the conscious concessions made by the woman, historically betrayed. Humankind first knew slavery with the advent of private property. Man, master of his slaves and of the land, became in addition the woman's master. This was the historic defeat of the female sex. It came about with the upheaval in the division of labor and as a result of new modes of production and a revolution in the means of production. In this way, paternal right replaced maternal right. Property was now handed down from father to son rather than as before from the woman to her clan. The patriarchal family made its appearance, founded on the sole and personal property of the father, who had become head of the family. Within this family, the woman was oppressed. Reigning supreme, the man satisfied sexual whims by mating with his slaves or courtesans. Women became his booty, his conquest and trade. He profited from their labor power and took his fill from the myriad of pleasures they afforded him. For their part, as soon as the masters gave them the chance, women took revenge in infidelity. Thus, adultery became the natural counterpart to marriage. It was the woman's only form of self-defense against the domestic slavery to which she was subjected. Her social oppression was a direct reflection of her economic oppression. Given this cycle of violence, inequality can be done away with only by establishing a new society where men and women will enjoy equal rights, resulting from an upheaval in the means of production and in all social relations. Thus, the status of women will improve only with the elimination of the system that exploits them. In fact, throughout the ages and wherever the patriarchy has triumphed, there has been a close parallel between class exploitation and women's inferior status. Of course, there were brighter periods where women, priestesses, or female warriors broke out of their oppressive chains, but the essential features of her subjugation have survived and been consolidated, both in everyday activity and in intellectual and moral repression. Her status, overturned by private property, banished from her very self, relegated to the role of child-raiser and servant, written out of history by philosophy, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and others, and the most entrenched religions, stripped of all worth by mythology, women shared the lot of a slave who in slave society was nothing more than a beast of burden with a human face. So it is not surprising that in its phase of conquest, the capitalist system, for which human beings are just so many numbers, should be the economic system that has exploited women the most brazenly and with the most sophistication. So, we are told, manufacturers in those days employed only women on their mechanized looms. They gave preference to women who were married, and among them to those with a family at home to support. These women paid greater attention to their work than single women, and were more docile, having no choice but to work to the point of exhaustion to earn the barest subsistence for their families. So we can see how women's particular attributes are turned against her, and all the most moral and delicate qualities of her nature become the means by which she is subjugated. Her tenderness, her love for her family, the meticulous care she takes with her work, all this is used against her, even as she guards herself against any weaknesses she might have. Thus, throughout the ages and throughout different types of society, women suffered a sorry fate in a continually reinforced position of inferiority to men. Though her inequality was expressed in many and varied guises, she remained unequal. In slave society, the male slave was looked upon as an animal, a means of production of goods and services. The woman, whatever her social rank, was crushed not only within her own class, but by other classes too. This was the case even for women who belonged to the exploiting classes. In feudal society, women were kept in a state of absolute dependence on men, justified by reference to women's supposed physical and psychological weakness. Often seen as a defiled object, a primary agent of indiscretion, women, with a few rare exceptions, were kept out of places of worship. In capitalist society, the woman, already morally and socially persecuted, is also subjugated economically, kept by the man if she does not work. Even then, she works herself to death. We will never be able to paint an adequate picture of the misery women suffer, nor show too strongly that women share the misery of proletarians as a whole. The specific character of women's oppression. Woman's fate is bound up with that of the exploited male. This is a fact. However, this solidarity arising from the exploitation that both men and women suffer and that binds them together historically must not cause us to lose sight of the specific reality of the woman's situation. The conditions of her life are determined by more than economic factors, and they show that she is a victim of a specific oppression. The specific character of this oppression cannot be explained away by setting up an equal sign or by falling into easy and childish simplifications. It is true that both she and the male worker are condemned to silence by their exploitation, but under the current economic system, the worker's wife is also condemned to silence by her worker husband. In other words, in addition to the class exploitation common to both of them, women must confront a particular set of relations that exist between them and men, relations of conflict and violence that use as their pretext physical differences. It is clear that the difference between the sexes is a feature of human society. This difference characterizes particular relations that immediately prevent us from viewing women, even in production, simply as female workers. The existence of relations of privilege, of relations that spell danger for the women, all this means that women's reality constitutes an ongoing problem for us. The male uses the complex nature of these relations as an excuse to sow confusion among women. He takes advantage of all the shrewdness that class exploitation has to offer in order to maintain his domination over women. This is the same method used by men to dominate other men in other lands. The idea was established that certain men, by virtue of their family origin and birth, or by divine right, were superior to others. This was the basis for the feudal system. Other men have managed to enslave whole peoples in this way. They used their origins or arguments based on their skin color as a supposedly scientific justification for dominating those who were unfortunate enough to have skin of a different color. This is what colonial domination and apartheid are based on. We must pay the closest attention to women's situation because it pushes the best of them into waging a sex war when it's a question of waging at bottom and in a complementary manner a clan or a class war. We have to say frankly that it is the attitude of men that makes such confusion possible. It is men's attitude that spawns the bold assertions made by feminism, certain of which have not been without value in the war that men and women are waging against oppression. This war is one we can and will win, if we understand that we need one another and are complementary, that we share the same fate, and, in fact, that we are condemned to interdependence. At this moment, we have little choice but to recognize that masculine behavior comprises vanity, irresponsibility, arrogance, and violence of all kinds toward women. This kind of behavior can hardly lead to coordinated action against women's oppression. And we must say frankly that such attitudes, which can sink to the level of sheer stupidity, are in reality nothing but a safety valve for the oppressed male, who, through brutalizing his wife, hopes to regain some of the human dignity denied him by the system of exploitation. This masculine foolishness is called sexism or machismo. It includes all kinds of moral and intellectual feebleness, even thinly veiled physical weakness, which often gives politically conscious women no choice but to consider it their duty to wage a war on two fronts. In order to fight and win, women must identify with the oppressed layers and classes of society, such as workers and peasants, etc. The man, however, no matter how oppressed he is, has another human being to oppress, his wife. To say this is, without any doubt, to affirm a terrible fact. When we talk about the vile system of apartheid, for example, our thoughts and emotions turn to the exploited and oppressed blacks, but we forget the black woman who has to endure her husband. This man who, armed with his passbook, allows himself all kinds of reprehensible detours before returning home to the woman who has waited for him so worthily in such privation and destitution. We should keep in mind, too, the white women of South Africa. aristocratic, with every possible material comfort, she is, unfortunately, still a tool for the pleasure of the lecherous white man. The only thing these men can do to blot out the terrible crimes they commit against blacks is to engage in drunken brawls and perverse, bestial sexual behavior. And there is no lack of examples of men otherwise progressive who live cheerfully in adultery, but who are prepared to murder their wives on the merest suspicion of infidelity. How many men in Burkina seek so-called consolation in the arms of prostitutes and mistresses of all kinds? And this is not to mention the irresponsible husbands whose wages go to keep mistresses or fill the coffers of bar owners. And what should we think of those little men, also progressive, who get together in sleazy places to talk about the women they have taken advantage of? They think this is the way they will be able to measure up to other men and even humiliate some of them by having seduced their wives. In reality, such men are pitiful and insignificant. They would not even enter our discussion if it were not for the fact that their criminal behavior has been undermining the morale and virtue of many fine women whose contribution to our revolution could be of the utmost importance. And then there are those more or less revolutionary militants, much less revolutionary than more, who do not accept that their wives should also be politically active, or who allow them to be active by day and by day only, or who beat their wives because they have gone out to meetings or to a demonstration at night. Oh, these suspicious, jealous men, what narrow-mindedness, and what a limited, partial commitment. For is it only at night that a woman who is disenchanted and determined can deceive her husband? And what is this political commitment that expects her to stop political activity at nightfall and resume her rights and responsibilities only at daybreak? And, finally, what should we make of remarks about women made by all kinds of activists, the one more revolutionary than the next? Remarks such as, quote, "Women are despicably materialist," unquote. Quote-unquote, manipulators, clowns, liars, gossips, schemers, jealous, and so on. Maybe this is all true of women, but surely it is equally true of men. Could our society be any less perverse than this when it systematically burdens women down, keeps them away from anything that is supposed to be serious and of consequence, and excludes them from anything other than the most petty and minor activities? When you are condemned, as women are, to wait for your lord and master at home in order to feed him and receive his permission to speak or just to be alive, what else do you have to keep you occupied and to give you at least the illusion of being useful, other than meaningful glances, gossip, chatter, furtive, envious glances at others, and the bad-mouthing of their flirtations and private lives? The same attitudes are found among men put in the same situation. Another thing we say about women, alas, is that they are always forgetful. We even call them bird brains, but we must never forget that a woman's whole life is dominated, tormented by a fickle, unfaithful, and irresponsible husband and by her children and their problems. Completely worn out by attending to the entire family, how could she not have haggard eyes that reflect distraction and absent-mindedness? For her, forgetting becomes an antidote to the suffering, a relief from the harshness of her existence, a vital self-defense mechanism. But there are forgetful men, too, a lot of them. Some forget by indulging in drink or drugs, others through the various kinds of perversity they engage in throughout life. Does anyone ever say that these men are forgetful? What vanity! What banality! Banalities, though, that men revel in as a way of concealing the weaknesses of the masculine universe, because this masculine universe in an exploitative society needs female prostitutes. We say that both the female and the prostitute are scapegoats. We defile them, and when we are done with them, we sacrifice them on the altar of prosperity of a system of lies and plunder. prostitution is nothing but the microcosm of a society where exploitation is a general rule. It is a symbol of the contempt men have for women. And yet this woman is none other than the painful figure of the mother, sister, or wife of other men, thus, of every one of us. In the final analysis, it is the unconscious contempt we have for ourselves. There can be prostitutes only as long as there are pimps and those who seek prostitutes. But who frequents prostitutes? First, there are the husbands who commit their wives to chastity while they relieve their depravity and debauchery upon the prostitute. This allows them to treat their wives with a seeming respect, while they reveal their true nature at the bosom of the lady of so-called pleasure. So, on the moral plane, prostitution becomes the counterpart to marriage. Tradition, customs, religion, and moral doctrines alike seem to have no difficulty adapting themselves to it. This is what our church fathers mean when they explain that, quote, sewers are needed to assure the cleanliness of the palace, unquote. Then there are the unrepentant and intemperate pleasure seekers who are afraid to take on the responsibility of a home with its ups and downs, and who flee from the moral and material responsibility of fatherhood. So they discreetly seek out the address of a brothel, a gold mine of relations that entail no responsibility on their part. There is also a whole bevy of men who, publicly at least and in quote-unquote proper company, subject women to public humiliation because of some grudge they have not had the strength of character to surmount, thus losing confidence in all women, who become from then on, quote, tools of the devil, unquote. Or else they do so out of hypocrisy, proclaiming their contempt for the female sex too often and categorically, a contempt that they strive to assume in the eyes of the public, from which they have extorted admiration through false pretenses. All these men end up night after night in brothels until occasionally their hypocrisy is discovered. Then there is the weakness of the man who is looking for a polyandrous arrangement. Far be it for us to make a value judgment on polyandry, which was the dominant form of relations between men and women in certain societies. What we are denouncing here are the courts of idle, money-grubbing gigolos lavishly kept by rich ladies. Within this same system, prostitution can, economically speaking, include both the prostitute and the, quote, materialist-minded, unquote, married woman. The only difference between the woman who sells her body by prostitution and she who sells herself in marriage is the price and duration of the contract. So, by tolerating the existence of prostitution, we relegate all our women to the same rank, that of a prostitute or wife. The only difference between the two is that the legal wife, though still oppressed, at least has the benefit of the stamp of respectability that marriage confers. As for the prostitute, all that remains for her is the market value of her body, a value that fluctuates according to the size of the male chauvinist's wallet. Isn't she just an object that increases or decreases in value according to the degree to which her charms wilt? Isn't she governed by the law of supply and demand? Prostitution is a tragic and painful representation of female slavery in all its forms. We should see in every prostitute an accusing finger pointing firmly at society as a whole. Every pimp, every partner in prostitution turns the knife in this festering and gaping wound that disfigures the world of man and leads to his ruin. In fighting against prostitution, in holding out a saving hand to the prostitute, we are saving our mothers, our sisters, and our wives from this social leprosy. We are saving ourselves. We are saving the world. Women's reality in Burkina Faso. If society sees the birth of a boy as a, quote, gift from God, unquote, the birth of a girl is greeted as an act of fate, or at best, an offering that can serve in the production of food and the perpetuation of the human race. The little male will be taught how to want and get, to demand and be served, to desire and take, to decide things without being questioned, The future woman, however, is dealt blow after blow by a society that unanimously, as one man, and, quote, as one man, unquote, is the appropriate term, drums into her head norms that lead nowhere. A psychological straitjacket called virtue produces a spirit of personal alienation within her. A preoccupation with being protected is nurtured in the child's mind, inclining her to seek the supervision of a guardian or drawing her into marriage. What a monstrous mental fraud! This child knows no childhood. From the age of 3, she must be true to her role in life, to serve and be useful. While her brother of 4 or 5 will play till he drops from exhaustion or boredom, she, with little ceremony, will enter into production. She already has a trade, assistant housewife. It is an occupation without pay since, as is generally said, a housewife, quote, does nothing, unquote. Do we not write, quote-unquote, housewife on the identity cards of women who have no income, signifying that they have no job, that they are, quote, not working, unquote? With the help of tradition and obligatory submissiveness, our sisters grow up more and more dependent, more and more dominated, and more exploited, with less and less free time for leisure. While the young man's road is strewn with opportunities to develop himself and take charge of his life, at every new stage of the young girl's life, the social straitjacket is pulled tighter around her. She will pay a heavy price for having been born female, and she will pay it throughout her whole life until the weight of her toil and the effects of her physical and mental self-negation lead her to the day of eternal rest. She is an instrument of production at the side of her mother, who is already more of a matron than a mother. She never sits idle, is never left to her games and toys, like her brother. Whichever direction we turn, from the central plateau in the northeast, dominated by societies where power is highly centralized, to the west, where the powers of the village communities are decentralized, or to the southwest, the land of scattered collectives, the traditional form of social organization has at least one point in common: the subjugation of women. In our 8,000 villages, on our 600,000 plots of land, and in our 1,000,000 and more households, on the question of women, we can see identical or similar approaches. From one end of the country to the other, social cohesion as defined by men requires the subjugation of women and the subordination of the young. Our society, still too primitively agrarian, patriarchal, and polygamous by far, turns the woman into an object of exploitation for her labor power, and of consumption for her reproductive capacity. How do women manage to live out this peculiar dual identity which makes them at one and the same time the vital knot that ties together the whole family by their presence and attention, guarantees its fundamental unity, and yet also makes them marginalized and ignored? The woman leads a twofold existence indeed, the depth of her social ostracism being equaled only by her own stoic endurance. In order to be able to live in harmony with the society of man, in order to obey his command, she envelops herself in demeaning and self-effacing detachment. She sacrifices herself to this. Woman, you are the source of life, yet an object, mother, yet domestic servant, nurturer, yet pseudo-woman. You can do the bidding of both soil and hearth, yet you are invisible, faceless, and voiceless. You are the pivot, the unifier, yet a being in chains, shadow of the male shadow. The woman is the pillar of family well-being, the midwife, washerwoman, cleaner, and cook. She is errand runner, matron, farmer, healer, gardener, grinder, saleswoman, worker. She is labor power working with obsolete tools, putting in hundreds of thousands of hours for a hopeless level of production. Every day, our sisters, fighting as they are on the four fronts of our war against disease, hunger, poverty, and degeneracy, feel the pressure of changes over which they have no control. For every single one of the 800,000 males who emigrate from Burkina, a woman takes on an additional load. The 2 million Burkinabe men who live outside the country thus exacerbate the sexual imbalance that puts women today at 51.7% of the total population, or 52.1% of the potentially active population. Too overburdened to give the necessary attention to her children, too exhausted to think of herself, the woman continues to slave away, the grinding wheel, wheel of fortune, drive wheel, spare wheel, the big wheel, broken on the wheel and bullied. Women, our sisters and wives, pay for creating life, for sustaining life. Socially, they are relegated to third place after the man and the child, just like the third world, arbitrarily held back, the better to be dominated and exploited. Subjugated, the woman goes from a protective guardian who exploits her to one who dominates her and exploits her even more. She is first to work and last to rest. She is first to fetch water and wood, first at the fire, yet last to quench her thirst. She may eat only if there is food left, and then only after the man. She is the very keystone of the family, carrying both family and society on her shoulders, in her hands, and in her belly. In return, she is paid with oppressive, pro-population growth ideology, food taboos, overwork, and malnutrition. Society rewards her with dangerous pregnancies, self-effacement, and innumerable other evils that make maternal deaths one of the most intolerable, unspeakable, and shameful defects of our society. Predatory intruders come to this bedrock of alienation from afar and foment the isolation of women, making their condition even more precarious. The euphoria of independence left women with all hopes dashed. Segregated off during negotiations, absent from all decisions, vulnerable and at the mercy of all, she has continued to be victim to family and society. Capital and bureaucracy have banded together to maintain her subjugation. Imperialism has done the rest. With an education level only half that of men, and with little training in skilled trades, women are 99% illiterate, and are discriminated against in the job market and confined to secondary jobs, and are the first to be harassed and fired. Yet, burdened as they are by 100 traditions and 1,000 excuses, never seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, women have continued to rise, to challenge after challenge. They have had to keep going, whatever the cost, for the sake of their children, their family, and for society in general. This has been part 1 of Thomas Sankara's The Revolution Cannot Triumph Without the Emancipation of Women, originally read as a speech March 8th, 1987, translated from the French into English. Please follow the link in the description if you'd like to read along. Thanks for reading along with me. Stay tuned for part 2.